Hello, everyone. I'm Rich Dubois, Executive Director of the National Consumer Law Center. I'd love to welcome you to the 2020 Consumer Rights Litigation Conference. I'm so glad you can join us today, especially during these extraordinary times. So this is, of course, our first ever virtual conference. While we'll miss seeing everyone in person, we are excited about the digital platform. I think you will like it. It is designed to give you plenty of opportunities to interact and meet with colleagues, and I encourage you to explore the site and check out its many features. So for those of you attending the conference for the first time, I welcome you and want you to know that this is a special community where you'll find many people willing to share their knowledge and collaborate. I hope you can participate in the many networking opportunities during the conference and get to know other attendees. I also encourage you to become a member of the National Association of Consumer Advocates, our close partner organization, if you have not done so already. NACA offers a wealth of resources and opportunities for everyone practicing consumer law, so I hope you do join. We have a terrific lineup of diverse speakers, topics, and sessions, as well as networking events over the next 2 weeks. And I encourage you to check all of them out. Also, in a special development, our conference band is going to make its return. COVID-19 would not deter the members of the band this year, and so I really hope you check them out. The RBGs is their name, so it's really special to have the band again once this year. So in a minute, we're going to hear from a distinguished panel on the meaning of last week's election. I really look forward to hearing their reactions and insights. Like many of you, I am relieved at the outcome and hopeful about the opportunities that lie ahead of us. We've spent most of the last 4 years defending consumer rights from attack, but now we have a critical opportunity to make real progress on fundamental issues of consumer, economic, and racial justice. All of us at the National Consumer Law Center are eager and ready to seize this important moment and achieve meaningful change. So I hope you are ready to join us, because only by working together can we win the fight for economic justice. So now I'd like to thank a few of the people who have made this conference possible this year. First, I'd like to thank the members of the 2020 Host Committee for their generous support. So special thanks go to our conference co-hosts, Francis Mailman and Sumilas, Bailey and Glasser, Leif Cabraser, Heinemann and Bernstein, and Oregon Consumer Justice. I'd also like to thank the executive committee members, Keogh Law, and Smith Marco, and members, Edelman, Combs, LaTurner, and Goodwin, Kazaruni Law Group, Chemnitzer, Barron, and Krieg, Phillips and Phillips, John Steinkamp and Associates, Terrell Marshall, and the Barnes Law Group. Thanks also should go to our sponsors, Huntington Bank, Law Zebra, Scott D. Owens, AB Data, American Legal Claims Services, and RSM. Thank you all very, very much. We could not have done this without you. I'm also happy to share that we have a special matching gift challenge this year. One of our conference co-hosts, Oregon Consumer Justice, is offering to match donations made during the course of the conference to support NCLC's work training consumer lawyers and advocating for stronger consumer protections. This is an incredibly generous challenge, which will match all donations of $25 or more, double all gifts of $100 or more, and triple all contributions of $1,000 or more, up to a total of $25,000. Please take a look at the link being added to the chat box for more information or to make a donation now. NCLC will be grateful for your support and for helping us realize the Oregon Consumer Justice Match. So I have just one technical note for everyone. During this plenary session, we will not be using PowerPoint slides, so please feel free to expand the box in your upper left-hand corner to simply view the videos or the presenters. If you need to ask a question, you can minimize this window to see the Q&A field. So with that, I'd like to get started with our panel discussion. We are thrilled to have a group of the country's leading experts on economic justice issues, and they are going to be here to help us make sense of last week's election. And they'll be seeing how we can best move forward together to achieve economic justice. There's going to be a lot to discuss, so we're planning to keep this conversation going until 12:15 p.m. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to the moderator of the discussion, the Associate Director of the National Consumer Law Center, and the head of our Washington, D.C. office, my colleague, Lauren Saunders. Lauren?
Thank you, Rich. Thank you so much to everybody for joining us for our conference and for our opening event on the presidency, the Congress, and the Supreme Court. What happened and what does it mean for our clients and our communities? A few technical notes just to start. This session is being recorded for on-demand viewing after the conference. All attendees are muted. Please turn off all other browsers or applications on your device in order to devote bandwidth to this presentation. IT and technical requirements and tech tips for joining the session are in the Help Tips tab next to the Bios tab. And you can submit questions, both substantive questions for our panelists, as well as IT-related questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So let's get started. This has certainly been a year for the history books. I don't know about the rest of you, but I have been exhausted and challenged to respond to the demands of a health and economic crisis that have wreaked so much havoc and pain across the country, but especially in low-income communities and communities of color. But this year has also brought a better appreciation for the minimum wage workers who we depend on and for their struggles. And it has brought a better understanding of the unrelenting racial injustices that go back to our founding, but continue to this day. And with broader understanding come opportunities. This election is an opportunity. And to help us sort out what it means, we have an incredible group of speakers. Sarah Rosen-Wortel is president of the Urban Institute, a leading think tank. And she was previously one of the founders of the Center for American Progress and deputy director of the National Economic Council under President Clinton. Robert Greenstein is the founder and president of the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, which over decades has been the leading source of expertise on budget and tax policies designed to reduce poverty and inequality. Gary Cunningham is the president and CEO of Prosperity Now, and he has brought to that role a wealth of experience in job creation and racial equity. Lisa Donner is the executive director of Americans for Financial Reform, where she leads a coalition of 200 consumer, labor, civil rights, and faith groups fighting for a fair financial system. And Paul Keel is an award-winning investigative journalist at ProPublica, where his work has covered many topics from the foreclosure crisis to predatory lending, debt collection, and many more. So let's get started. Sarah, let's start with you. The election took place against a backdrop of a pandemic that provoked different political responses and affected different communities differently. How has COVID shaped the country, and what are the priorities coming out of this crisis that we need to address? Unmute yourself, Sarah.
Oh, I'm so sorry. You'd think I'd have gotten the hang of it by now. Thank you so much, Lauren. It's great to be here and really appreciate the invitation and to be with all of you on this cheerful morning. Let me just set a minute of context and we can talk about what next. It's important to remember, and I think each of you see this through the people who you work with every day, that before COVID happened, lower wage workers and especially also workers of color were only just beginning to see the benefits of growth affecting their wages and their employment opportunities at the bottom of the economy. It took almost 10 years before prosperity started to be shared. With COVID, whatever that advantage finally was with labor market tightening, it came to an abrupt halt, with terrible wage and employment impact on the bottom of the labor market, and especially, again, as on communities of color. And we're also likely seeing a decade of industrial transformation accelerated. Jobs are changing because of technology in ways that they won't necessarily go back, and some people won't have jobs to return to. While many of us found technology helped us to adapt and be resilient, for others, it may mean the end of their prior way of life. Shocks and stresses often have the most lasting impact on the bottom of the labor market, and those folks take the longest to recover. And just as soon as they do, another comes along. We are likely to continue to see health shocks, regional environmental disasters, technological change accelerate their pace. So we already had a fragile place for so many of the folks that all of us work towards. We're also starting to see that the business community and so much of the public is understanding what the Trump administration did not, that our economic recovery is dependent upon managing the pandemic. And I just note that we are starting to see higher rates of COVID in new places, in parts of the economy, particularly across the center of the country where it was less prevalent before. So so far, thankfully, not quite as deadly as it was at its earlier stages, but still nonetheless, we're likely to see continued rise, real serious health impacts, employment impacts, and potential if it could overwhelm systems. So what does that problem mean for the Biden administration? So a couple of first things. We know that this is an administration that's coming in believing, once again, refreshingly, that facts matter. But we need facts that are in real time and disaggregated by population to design policy. And you're still dealing with, even after Inauguration Day, a world in which so much of the country is going to be getting their facts from different sources and believing very different things. One of our most painful realizations of this election is how differently people understand circumstances on the ground. Clearly, the very first thing for the Biden administration is going to be some kind of stabilization package that will deal with both health and economic consequences. Bob's going to speak in a few moments. I'll let others talk to you about what might happen during the lame duck and the likelihood of legislation early in the Biden administration. But health and economic recovery are going to be top of mind. And I'll just note that if, as we looks possible, maybe even likely, although there depends on what happens in Georgia, it is possible that there will only be a limited number of legislative opportunities, and they will require some cross the aisle participation. So we also can expect that this administration is going to use the power of the pen far greater than perhaps even President Obama did, with both the agenda to reverse a lot of executive orders that are deeply concerning, and also probably also just administrative program design of how they run the current programs in ways that try to respond to really unique circumstances. We should expect to see a climate-related lens across much of the economic issues that this administration is going to face, because I think they've made clear that's a central lens for them. And finally, I certainly hope that we do not lose the momentum that was created by the moment of national racial reckoning this summer. With the economic hardship so disproportionate on communities of color, I hope we will be intentional, not only looking at the immediate harm, but the underlying structural conditions that created some of the harm for Black and other people of color, and think intentionally about how we can not just get back to where we were before COVID, but how we can try to remedy some of the longstanding discrimination and harm that those communities have faced. Finally, I will just say that given the state of sort of a divided country and a likely divided Washington, it's going to be critically important for us to continue to look to state and local government for remedies that protect folks. And we can talk later about the eviction crisis, which is one of the areas where I think we may see a lot of work continue at the state and local level, hopefully with some federal resources. But we are going to have to be able to see that local leaders are going to be able to make some change in ways that we may not be able to make at the federal level. So thanks for having me. Look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Sarah. So Bob, with COVID infections rising, millions still unemployed, and hardship deep and widespread, what are the prospects in Congress to pass a major stimulus package? And what can people do to improve the prospects for significant relief?
Thanks, Lauren. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for inviting me, and my apologies in advance that I'll need to jump at 12 noon. So as I think probably all of you know, back in May, the House passed the HEROES bill, the next stimulus attempt at the next stimulus relief bill, about a $3.4 trillion package. The House passed HEROES 2 in September, bringing it down about $1 trillion. And Pelosi and Treasury Secretary Mnuchin were negotiating a deal before the election that would have been close to $2 trillion. But all of that is in the past. The White House, the election being passed, no longer seems to have much interest in this. And Mnuchin has handed the reins over to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell to do the negotiations on their side from here on in. Now, McConnell has indicated in the past few days that he wants to negotiate a new deal that would pass in the lame duck session in December. He's particularly keen on doing this because this is no secret. He wants to put provisions in the bill that will help the 2 Republican senators from Georgia who face runoffs on January 5th. Look, for example, for airline bailout money. Delta Airlines has a huge hub and headquarters, I believe, in Atlanta, Georgia. Now, I do expect negotiations to start on this relatively soon. Democrats had hoped that there would be a trifecta and that they could use something called the budget reconciliation process to pass a big relief bill that would only need 51 votes in the Senate to pass, not 60. But the unlikelihood that they will have a majority in the Senate has dampened those hopes. And besides, they cannot refuse McConnell's attempt to negotiate a deal for lame duck, not only because the virus cases are rising exponentially now, as all of you know, but also because the key unemployment insurance provisions passed last March expire on December 31st, and in the absence of action, millions of people in the weeks after that will see their unemployment benefits simply go to zero in the absence of a deal. So where do we go from here? McConnell is privately indicating he's willing to go up some over where he was a month or two ago, but doesn't want to go above $1 trillion for the package, which in my view is much too small for the need. Pelosi wants it closer to $2 trillion. These are going to be tough negotiations. Each side needs the other in order to get the votes to pass something. I think the key issues for the negotiation include, beyond, of course, testing and tracing and things to combat the virus, include the following: unemployment insurance. Let me quickly note here that the top issue is not getting $600 a week back. We do need a federal supplement, but whether it's $600 or $500 or $400, That is less important than two even more critical unemployment insurance issues. One, does the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program created in March continue beyond December 31st? This is the program that enables millions of low-income workers who don't otherwise qualify for UI because of its restrictive rules to get UI benefits. If it ends, millions go to nothing. Secondly, how many weeks of benefits can you get before you expire all your UI benefits? It's now much too low for a recession that just keeps hurtling forward. We're way below the number of weeks we had in the Great Recession. And what that means is if the number of weeks isn't beefed up significantly, starting in January, February, with each passing week, hundreds of thousands of more people will hit the limit, exhaust all their UI benefits, and get nothing from that point forward. There are, as Sarah alluded to, huge issues on the housing front. Millions way behind on rent, evictions looming, a critical issue for the next package. Similarly, the need for more food assistance, also critical. For those of you across the country, I don't need to tell you, state and local fiscal relief, a very big deal. We already have lost more than 1 million state and local public sector jobs. And many states have been holding back on new cuts until they see if the federal government will provide more relief, and in some cases till they got past the election. In the absence of substantial new fiscal relief, we're likely going to get big budget cuts that harm people in need in many states across the country. Another key issue is childcare. A lot more resources needed, so child care centers can stay open or reopen and can be there for people as they can go back to work. And I'll do a last one, an issue that I know your organization has worked on over the years, the refundable tax credits, the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit. As you know, the amount of the credit rises with your level of earnings for people at the bottom of the earnings distribution. And what that means is that when people file their 2020 tax returns, if they had much lower earnings in 20 than in 19, their refundable credits are going to collapse. Example, a mother with 2 kids who earned $15,000 a year in 2019, but whose earnings fell to $5,000 a year in 2020 because of the pandemic and recession. Her EITC and child tax credit combined will fall from $7,800 to $2,400, a loss of over $5,000 on top of her $10,000 loss of wages. It's easy to fix. You put a provision in the package next month that says that when people do their 2020 tax returns, they have the option of using either their 2019 earnings or their 2020 earnings for calculating the credits. There's some bipartisan support for that. We have a real shot at it. These negotiations will start soon. And so for those of you who can engage in advocacy, I would strongly recommend focusing on what you see as the most key issues and negotiating with your members of Congress, but in particular with Republican senators, asking them to go to McConnell, making sure these key issues are dealt with. McConnell is the key here. It's no longer the White House. And there really needs to be a lot of effort to have members of his caucus telling him that they need these various things dealt with adequately, given the crisis, the hardship, and the need in our country. Thanks.
Thank you, Bob. Okay, turning to Gary. Trump voters had a lot of reasons for voting for him, but many are interpreting the election as a sign of a country deeply divided on issues of race. Are there ways to address the longstanding racial injustices and inequality in the current political landscape?
Well, thank you, Lauren, for having me, and I really appreciate the work that you and your colleagues are doing and the great panel you put together here today. Thank you so much. I'd like to first start off saying that the country is deeply divided, but this isn't the only time it's been deeply divided. In fact, we had a civil war to free people from slavery, and that That sentiment continues today with the protests of racial, economic change that's needed in this country so that we can all participate fully in our democracy and our capitalist system. And I think there are many good signs of people recognizing that something needs to be done differently. The Business Roundtable just came out with a major set of policies that they think needs to change. We've seen some of the larger banks come out with major packages to deal with equity and opportunity. But we're also living in a time of punctuated equilibrium, meaning the time we're living in is unprecedented, and that the disconnections that we see and the damage done to the economy that the previous speakers have already talked about will require a more significant effort than ever before. In these times, if you look at the Great Depression or the New Deal that came out of that, what you see is that they recognized at that time that they had to come together to actually formulate something that would really transform the middle class in this country, and they did. In fact, we've seen the lower of economic inequalities from about 1935 to the early 80s, in part because there was a different tax structure that was put in place to ensure that everybody could benefit. However, those systems that were put in place were also flawed because they didn't include people of color. In fact, there was intentional discrimination on many different levels that maintained a Jim Crow system in our country into the early 1960s. And we still find today with COVID, with the economic tsunami that we're facing, that people of color and low-income whites are suffering, and all of us are suffering because of that. So let me say a few things here. One, there are ways for us to get there. The Prosperity Now and the Other and Belonging Institute out of the University of California, Berkeley, we conducted a survey this fall that showed that there are areas of agreement, even across this wide variation and divide that we see in the presidential election. So for example, a majority of Americans, white, Black, and Latina, actually support increasing the child care tax credit. A plurality of Americans actually agree that we need to do something to address economic inequalities for people of color, and actually support the idea of a baby bond that would be an investment in young people at an early age. And then later in life, when they turn 18, they could actually make an investment in housing or jobs or economic opportunity. They also agree, believe it or not, that there needs to be police reform in this country. And so there was a great deal of polarity, and actually a majority of Americans believe that we need to change our criminal justice system to be fair in this country. So while there is some divides within this country, there is a majority of Americans that actually believe in some broad-based strategies to actually transform America. I'd also like to think about what we're facing and how we're going to address it. Unless we build an economic base in communities of color, that actually they can participate in our financial systems and structures, we won't be able to change the circumstances. So business as usual won't be in place. And I was so pleased to hear President Biden talk about his debt to the Black community specifically, and that he's with us in this journey, because it's not going to be incremental change that's going to get us there. It actually has to be a movement of people, a multiracial coalition that needs to be built around these issues that we can agree on, that give the president the authority to actually act on these issues. I would also argue that we need to invest in our small business infrastructure. Prior to COVID, what we saw was a lot of talk about small businesses, but not the significant investment that we need to build small businesses. And these are the businesses that are building the majority of jobs in our country. In fact, the investment was about $4 billion prior to COVID. And now in small businesses. And that just isn't going to carry it, given that PPP and some of the other acts that were passed didn't trickle down to African Americans and Latino businesses in this country. So I would argue that we need to quadruple our investment in both money, markets, and management expertise in communities of color, particularly brown and black communities, and that this actually could have a bipartisan support in getting us there. So I think while the future has some dim parts to it, I think this punctuated equilibrium that we're in gives us the opportunity to actually do something fantastic for the American people. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Gary. Lisa, assuming that Republicans continue to control the Senate, President-elect Biden can't count on getting much through Congress. How should he use the executive branch to accomplish his agenda?
Thanks, Lauren, and many thanks for the opportunity to be part of this conversation today, and even more for all the amazing work that NCLC does and that so many of the folks participating in this conference are a part of. We are incredibly grateful to get to collaborate with you all. So as your question points out, the likely, though not certain, continuing Republican majority in the Senate is indeed a serious challenge to some of the big changes to advance economic and racial justice that we think the country needs. But there are absolutely many tools President-elect Biden will be able to use, and many levers the administration can pull to make change nonetheless. First, in the space that we at AFR and many of you work in, finance and financial regulation, there are all the alphabet soup of regulatory agencies which together have huge authority over fundamentally important parts of the economy. Financial regulation can and should be a tool for advancing economic justice and for fighting discrimination and systemic racism. The current overlapping crisis of COVID-19, the economic pain it's causing, the way its profoundly uneven impact reflects and amplifies the harm of existing racial and economic inequalities. All of that make it especially urgent that those tools are put to work, but it was urgent anyway. And I think the moment actually underlines, and we need to figure out how to take advantage of the fact that financial regulations are not just technical rules. They're about families' basic security and opportunity to thrive, and they need to be used as tools in that direction. In order to do that, a Biden administration will need to be ambitious in its appointments to key economic policy and financial regulatory positions, and not settle for people they hope it'll be easy to confirm because they're industry friendly. They'll need to fight for those nominees, and if they're stalled, we'll have to help. And if they're stalled, those of us who can, or blocked, they'll need to use their authority to fill open positions through the Vacancy Act or through recess appointments. The Vacancy Act, as an aside, allows the president to make sure key agencies can keep functioning by putting in place acting directors who can be either people already confirmed by the Senate to a government position or senior employees of the particular agency in question. And then the people who hold these jobs need to be bold in the way they use their agency's authority to make life better for people. What's at stake here? Just to take a couple of examples, the CFPB can return to stopping debt trap payday lending. It can take on abusive overdraft fees, putting tens of billions of dollars back in people's pockets. It can return to enforcing the law against big consumer finance ripoffs and not just little ones, and making wrongdoers actually pay people back and pay a cost for their law breaking. So it's not just a cost of doing business. It can protect people from debt collection, harassment, abuses rather than enabling it. It can step up to use its authority to reduce the harm of the current economic crisis rather than allowing financial companies to take advantage of it or to make it worse. I started with the consumer space, but the other financial regulators make decisions that profoundly shape economic security or the lack thereof for all of us as well. Are big banks and other Wall Street companies allowed to take risks that potentially endanger economic stability, reap the profits when things go well, but wreak havoc for all of us when they don't, and then get bailed out, while economically vulnerable people suffer the most? Can firms act like they're offering sound investment advice when they're actually promoting products that lead to higher fees for themselves and lower returns for people saving for retirement, or families' hard-earned retirement savings protected? Can private equity firms repeatedly lie to institutional investors about returns and fees and then use workers' retirement savings to pay themselves while gutting businesses and destroying jobs? Are small businesses used as an excuse for deregulation that actually has nothing to do with them? Or is there an actual commitment to sustainable capital access for truly small businesses and small businesses owned by people of color? So are we building a financial system that supports good jobs for the long term? Moving on from financial regulatory agencies, there's an enormous amount the president can do on financial justice and financial reform still more directly, including by naming a Treasury Secretary who's committed to these issues and will find and use every opportunity to advance them. But here's one very important specific example. President-elect Biden has actually already promised student debt forgiveness at some level. And this fall, Senator Schumer and Warren underlined that the president has the authority to cancel student debt for federal student loan borrowers without congressional action, using authority under the Higher Education Act. With national student loan debt an astounding $1.5 trillion, this would be a huge help to families and to the broader economy as it puts money back in people's pockets. And it would be a step to help close the racial wealth gap. Black graduates leave college with thousands more in student debt than their white peers. And within a few years, that gap triples rather than closing. Some other super quick thoughts. This administration used the Centers for Disease Control to offer some, although inadequate, protections against eviction to renters. Even as we continue to fight for more comprehensive protections through legislation, President-elect Biden should strengthen those and take additional steps to make sure the pain of COVID is not made worse by wage garnishment or debt collection or credit reporting that turns present pain into future denial of access. And President-elect Biden can reverse what this administration has done in rolling back protections against discrimination and immediately affirm a commitment to aggressively enforcing the law, including by using disparate impact standard. That list could go on. Finally, we in the administration shouldn't give up on putting legislative ideas on the table and fighting for support for them. To take one example, we have a Republican co-sponsor for our rate cap and anti-payday lending bill in the House and found some Republican interest in the Senate, even as we also have continuing opposition from some Democrats. But the public overwhelmingly supports rate caps across party lines. If we organize and mobilize, we may be able to win, and where we can't win, we can make it clear what's at stake and who stands where and lay the groundwork for future wins.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa. Paul, the coronavirus crisis is leaving people with mounds of debt that could be around for years. How does that debt affect communities, and what can we do about it, especially if action in Congress seems unlikely?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I guess I'd start by stepping back a bit and kind of reviewing what has happened in terms of debt these last 6 or 7 months or so. One thing that has been really striking to me has been, all of the aid that was poured into the economy, and particularly to low-income communities through the CARES Act. There's been now some surveys done by the Federal Reserve and others in terms of how that money was used. The New York Fed survey found that about a third of the stimulus checks on average were used to pay down debt. And for low-income people, those under $40,000, there was 40% of the stimulus checks were used to pay down debt. And then for people on unemployment, the percentage is even higher. About half of the money was going to pay down debt. So that's one thing that goes to explain kind of this very odd situation we've been in, where unemployment has been going up, and yet you haven't seen the usual increase in delinquencies in credit. And then there's also been this kind of amazing consequence that debt collectors have been rolling in it, essentially. The debt buyers have had their best quarters ever in the second and the third quarter of this year. Record revenue, record profits. They're getting that record revenue through phone and digital collections, not necessarily through the courts, although they haven't stopped going through the courts as well. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is if there is another round of stimulus, and it does seem like one area of bipartisan agreement is the stimulus check idea. It seems like that comes from both the right and the left. If there is another round of stimulus, that is one consequence of that, is that you would expect to see something like this happen again in terms of a lot of this money going to pay down debt. At the same time, we're seeing debt collection lawsuits return to normal levels. the one caveat to that is that because we're in this pandemic, it's not a normal downturn. So certain creditors, essentially the ones that are susceptible to public pressure or to reputational concerns, so like the big banks, particularly Capital One, which is always, suing among about the same levels as the debt buyers. They are not suing because of, they don't want to be suing customers during a pandemic. At some point, they'll probably go back to suing their customers, but for now, they're going to hold off. And other types of, service providers or creditors, nonprofit hospitals comes to mind. Sometimes they can be very aggressive with collection, and they're susceptible to reputational pressure in a way that they wouldn't otherwise be. And then on the other side of the coin, you have debt buyers, which essentially don't care and will keep on doing what they're going to do. So you have this kind of mixed outlook right now. So you have delinquencies have not gone up yet, but on the flip side, everyone knows that there's a lot of pain out there. And what can happen, what I've seen in the past, is you have various systems that can trap people in various ways. And so you end up in a situation where your wages are garnished, you're left, needing for extra money every month, maybe you take out a high cost loan, and you end up in this cycle where these different systems sort of mutually reinforce themselves to prevent people from getting out. And that is something where, state and local regulations can make a very large difference. For instance, with limits on garnishment, there has been movement in recent years in states, protecting money from bank account garnishment. So now, like in California, they can't take someone's last dollar. That is a big change. There's, changes in some states that are raising the floor in terms of who's protected from wage garnishment. Those are state laws that need to change at the state level, and they can have enormous effects on people. And similarly with high cost lending, before the CFPB, you saw things like state ballot initiatives on interest rate caps that I think maybe slowed down a little bit when the CFPB looked like it was going to do something on payday lending. And now, that sort of thing maybe has become newly relevant depending on how the CFPB ends up looking. So there's a couple areas that I'll be watching and a couple areas to keep in mind, keeping the state and local regulations in mind in addition to what happens in Washington.
Great. Thank you, Paul. Let me remind people that you can submit questions in the Q&A chat at the bottom. So Sarah, you mentioned the looming eviction crisis. A lot of communities still haven't even recovered from the last foreclosure crisis. And, we may have a second foreclosure crisis as well. What can President-elect Biden do to prevent massive losses of homes?
Thanks. Critically important question. So first, a couple of context setting. I want to observe, as Paul has, the ways in which American consumers have, in fact, put paying their creditors, and in many cases their single largest creditor is their landlord, first. So in the last CARES Act package, people got both, not everyone, and there were major holes in this, but those who were lucky enough to be eligible either because they lost jobs and were eligible for UI, and also all the individuals who got COVID payments, a surprising number of those people paid their rent first. Even though their incomes were not, and even though there were eviction moratoriums in place. And so we did not see the level of rent or mortgage delinquencies. The mortgages, there were some mechanisms for forbearance and restructuring in place for those who had mortgages that fell under federal insurance programs. But across the board, we were generally very surprised at how relatively low were the levels of rent delinquencies and mortgage delinquencies. And I even know families who were not eligible for UI or COVID payment who, as soon as they had a little bit of income, paid all of their rent first. So it's a fascinating dynamic. And if you were to think from a macro public policy about sharing pain across the economy when people are struggling, particularly when they don't know when wages are coming back. Not sure whether that is actually what we would think would be optimal for their long-term welfare or not. But people want to keep a roof over their heads, and they're not utterly confident. And they also know that if you are evicted, that the long-term cost to a family of the moving and of finding places to store your stuff and the like, as Matt Desmond has demonstrated, are so extraordinary. About 44 million renters across the country, 48 million home families with mortgages. And generally speaking, we know that the folks who were renters were much more financially vulnerable than the homeowners. They had lower incomes, they lacked emergency funds, they had less access to credit, and far less job and income stability. We estimate that about 5.3 million households suffered a job loss, and between 3 and 5 million, we thought that somewhere between 3 and 5 billion in monthly assistance is needed to provide enough income support to return those households to being able to pay what their rent burden was as of October 1st. That's our estimate. So clearly there's a huge need for rent payments. And as Bob detailed, the CARES Act had a program that would be particularly well targeted, designed through the emergency support grants to those at the most vulnerable level at the bottom of the income package. If we are unable to get, the HEROES Act, well, the CARE would do that. The CARES Act did not have any housing support. The fact that the housing crisis was less severe was largely because people used their UI payments, unemployment insurance, and their CARES Act payments to pay their rent. The eviction moratorium is not a full moratorium. The eviction moratorium does not stop a landlord from beginning proceedings. It only stops them from pushing you out the door. And so we do believe there's a sizable amount of intimidation that's happening for renters, in which people are actually picking up and leaving because they don't want to get into this issue, even though they could stay through this process. So we are very worried about both the credit quality and the ability to rent in the household when this moratorium comes to the end, if there's not something else. So first and foremost, with Congress, ideally, we would have assistance that is targeted to renters, as well as an expansion and continuation of the forbearance. With mortgages, you can restructure the mortgages, put the payments at the end, the lender and the landlord, or the guarantor and the homeowner sort of sharing some of that and spreading it out over time. With rent, you don't have that same option. And we should also remember that about half of our folks these are not large, tall apartment buildings like we think of in urban areas often. People are renting from another homeowner, or they're renting in 2 to 4 family units, or in small prop buildings of 20 units or so. And we found that it was landlords of color, particularly Black and Hispanic landlords, who were forbearing rent in particular and restructuring rent payments, essentially forgiving part of it at a much higher rate. So giving the tenant ability to pay the rent to those landlords at some reasonable level is also important for the quality of the housing stock, and also for the small business and entrepreneurship of many minority small business. So hopefully we will have some kind of rental assistance program that will allow people to continue to pay rent. At a minimum, we absolutely need income support for low and moderate income families so that they can make the choice to pay some rent and sustain. We need an expansion of the eviction moratorium to deal with the continuing duration of this, of course, with exceptions for people who are abusing someone's property and the like, but with careful protection so that those exceptions are not abused. I think more generally, though, we have big structural issues in the housing market. The supply problems, the mismatch between its supply and demand is only going to grow. The affordability in the suburbs is prices are rising dramatically right now, which is only going to further lock people out of places of opportunity. And we don't want to see the concentrated foreclosures in particular neighborhoods when we come out of this. And we have learned so much about what not to do from the last crisis. Hopefully we will be able to use our executive authority and possibly, I think, bipartisan legislative support around at least around the mortgages. I would hope around the renters, but I'm less sure. One final observation I'll make. There is a resistance on the Republican side to putting funds through through HUD. It's wrong, it's unfair in my mind, but I think it is real. And so one of the other questions is whether there are some structures that might use some kind of treasury restructurings of debt for landlords, for tenants, for landlords for mortgages that would then pass down. It is a lot of concern about that because they don't trust that the funds will reach the individual tenants. But if we can't get some kind of assistance directly to tenants, and if we have to find a bipartisan way, I think there is more possibility of some kind of housing debt on both the rental and the single family side, some kind of debt restructuring that might be another way with the right protections to get some assistance to tenants. So fingers crossed.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Bob, beyond an immediate stimulus package, how do you see President-elect Biden's policies affecting low and moderate income people? Do you see any opportunities?
Important opportunities. Let's start with the executive. First, I do want to say I strongly second everything Sarah just said on the housing front. Very important. The Biden administration, as we're all reading, is going to start, I think, on day one on the executive action front. And there are all sorts of areas there that are critically important for low-income people. Just start with reversing a number of the really harmful Trump executive actions, such as the public charge rule that inhibits millions of low-income people and immigrant or mixed-status families from getting various forms of assistance that they're legally eligible for under the law, but they're now afraid to go get them. I absolutely expect the Biden administration to reverse that policy. A little unclear how long it'll take through the regulatory process, and there's a role for all of us when they do. Simply reversing the policy won't be enough. All of us and people in communities across the country will have a role to play to try to explain to the affected families that it's now safe again to secure assistance for which they're eligible. A lot will need to be done to reduce the climate of fear. Executive action on other fronts, withdrawing a series of Trump actions that are through executive action aimed at taking hundreds of thousands or millions of low-income people off the SNAP program. Medicaid, no longer approving state waivers with work requirements and beginning to try to reverse various state waivers that have been approved that are really harmful to low-income consumers. So there's a great deal on that front. On the legislative front, I want to lift up two important visionary advances that President-elect Biden called for in his campaign. One is to take the child tax credit and make it fully refundable. Today, something like 27 million children in lower income families get no child tax credit or only a small partial credit because it shuts out people at the very bottom. Making that credit fully refundable, regardless of your income, you get the full amount per child of the credit. Researchers have shown that that would dramatically reduce child poverty. It improves children's lifelong prospects. It has a little bipartisan support. Mitt Romney, really important to do. Not something Mitch McConnell's going to readily accept, but there's going to be a tax bill sooner or later. There always is. And the Biden administration can insist on getting as close to that as possible. And in the housing area, the remarkable Biden proposal to effectively make low-income rental assistance an entitlement. Today, only 1 in 4 low-income renter households that are eligible for 1 in 5, Sarah is saying, gets anything at all. Now, to be sure, converting this to a full entitlement immediately wouldn't have been able to pass even in a Democratic Congress. But we can start making major steps towards it. The Biden administration could, for example, in its first budget, propose something like I don't know, funding 100,000 or 200,000 new rental vouchers every year, building on it year by year, trying to get as close to that as you could through the appropriations process, trying to get other positive things for housing in an infrastructure bill. There could conceivably be a bipartisan infrastructure bill at some point. So all of these are areas in which advances are possible on the legislative front. Yeah, we probably won't get the full advance that Biden called for in the campaign in the next year or two. But starting down that path and getting as big increments towards the goal as possible will be important. And in some of these areas may well be possible.
Great. Thank you. We have a question for Gary. You mentioned small businesses. And of course, we had the PPP program, but a lot of that money ended up going to big businesses and not making it to the small ones, and in particular, not to the ones in Black and brown communities. Was the problem the amount of money in the program, or was it in the program's execution? Gary, unmute yourself.
I was talking away. Actually, it was in the program design. Black and brown businesses actually, in many cases, don't go to big banks for their financial services. They actually work through either alternative lenders, including CDFIs. And in fact, it's been demonstrated that many Black and brown committees go through CDFIs, but it wasn't really built into the structure to actually have CDFIs play that role until late in the game. And there were some administrative changes that allowed some of that to happen. But we're calling for $1 billion investment in CDFIs that serve communities of color specifically, and broader low-income communities as well. And so in order to address this issue, you've got to actually work with the infrastructure on the ground that is working with those communities, et cetera. I think the other issue that we have, and it's a bigger issue, and as my colleagues have said, I'm not sure that it would pass, but we've got to look at our credit box. The credit box that we're using is designed to get the results that we have. So example, on home ownership, African Americans have a home ownership rate of 42%. Unacceptable. And it is in part because of this credit box that has driven home ownership for African American communities that we have less African Americans becoming business owners, because most business owners use their home equity in order to get into business, or friends and family. So those are some of the issues. I would also say that the infrastructure to provide support to the brown and Black businesses also have the same issues as the businesses themselves. They have a lack of equity on their balance sheets. They have a difficulty sustaining themselves. And so therefore the support is sporadic in communities of color. So we need to build the ecosystem on the ground in local communities of the CDFIs, but also the support organizations that provide the technical assistance and resources to Black and brown businesses. So in order to change what's happening, we have to stop doing the same things we've been doing. And that means that the federal government, as well as local governments, are actually going to have to change the way that organizations of color, particularly those support organizations for businesses, have the supports they need in order to actually expedite a change. Because with COVID and with the devastation that's happening in our communities, as some would say, white people catch a cold, Black people have pneumonia. And that is so true with the COVID case that we have in front of us today. And so we actually have to do something pretty bold. And I'm a little concerned that we're just going to stay in the box inside the Beltway and not really get at what needs to happen for Black and brown people and low-income whites across this country.
Thank you. Question for Lisa. A lot of people are somewhat skeptical of Biden in light of his past support for the credit card industry and the bankruptcy bill. And of course, we're now seeing moderates and progressives jockeying for influence in the administration. What are the big issues that progressives are going to have to fight for, and what can people outside of DC, like those attending this conference, do to help fight for real change for struggling consumers?
Thanks, Lauren. I mean, I think I would want to start by kind of framing the question or reframing it a little bit. It's certainly the case that the election likely, though not certainly, kept in place a Republican Senate with a history of blocking not just progressive policy, but any policy can get away with blocking that would help a Democratic president. And both the Biden administration and we have to figure out how to deal with that. Whatever the starting goals of the administration are. But I think it's important for us to say that what the election didn't do was suggest that the country wants moderate economic policy, whatever that exactly means. President-elect Biden won a very solid majority of the popular vote, which is not to say that they're not real and serious divisions and many millions of votes on the other side. But everything we know from polling and from lots of actual voting on initiatives and referendums at the local level tells us that support for consumer financial protection and for rewriting the rules for Wall Street is much broader than the vote for Biden for president, and it includes Republican voters and independent voters, as well as Democratic voters. And that what stood in the way of making changes along these lines is not a lack of public support or the fact that there are not ways to make change or levers for change, but the fact that the money and power of those who benefit from the status quo has been overwhelming. And lawmakers and other decision makers have been too willing to give into it. And when they do, they end up talking about economic justice or racial justice, but not either winning or fighting really for policy changes that would deliver it. So I think all of us need to keep insisting on what those levers are, and that people need to fight to actually make change, even when powerful people oppose it and moneyed interests oppose it. And I think all that is fairly obvious, but it is an incredibly powerful dynamic that, if it's not taken head on, makes it impossible to make change and makes it impossible for people to maintain hope that it is possible to make change. I think in addition to the power of those big companies and those who benefit most from them, their senior executives opposing reform, they also benefit from the apparent obscurity or complexity or technical nature of the issues that we work on, and so many of you work on and care about. And so the question, I think, for all of us is what we do about that and how we take it on. Before I come back to that, I want to take 1 second without belaboring it, just to look at the results of some polling that we did with CRL this fall before the election. That is a reminder of where people are on this. Over 9 in 10 voters say it's important to regulate financial services and products to ensure they're fair to consumers, including 68% who say it's very important. And that includes 94% of Democrats, 90% of Republicans, and 84% of independents. Nearly 3/4 of voters believe that Wall Street financial companies should be held accountable with tougher rules and enforcement, while only 1 in 10 believe that their practices have changed enough since the financial crisis that they don't need more than regulation. That's more than 80% of Democrats, 70% of Republicans, and 63% of independents. I could go on, but I'll stop.
Yeah, we've got just a few minutes left. Quick question.
Can I say one last thing then? The most important, I think the most important, coming back to the question about how we deal with both the obscurity and the power. I think the input of the folks in this audience and people who deal with clients every day, who confront the impact of unfair financial practices and of a system that's stacked against them all the time, the role that you can play in making clear what is happening, bringing a story about it to the public, to the regulators, to the administration, in working with your clients to tell their own story and partnering with national organizations and with state and local organizations, I think is an incredibly important and necessary ingredient of making change in these areas.
All right, thanks, Lisa. Paul, can you just give us a real quick answer? Biden pledged to repeal Trump's corporate tax cuts. But you've been writing about the IRS. Are there things that he can do to make tax collection more progressive without Congress?
Yeah, so I mean, except there is some good news, is there have been some noises from the Republican Senate that they might support some more increased funding for the IRS, which has basically been starved for the last 10 years. There's some relatively less controversial areas that maybe could benefit, like, LATC and Taxpayer Advocate maybe could see a boost, but generally Republicans like to hold down the enforcement budget. The one thing I focused on a lot of is the disproportionate number of audits that have been done of EITC recipients relative to audits at the top of the income spectrum. And so the good news there is there has been a lot of focus on it. I don't know that a lot of minds on the Republican side of the aisle has necessarily been changed, but probably the tenor of that debate will change somewhat. I'm not sure exactly how that would morph. One area I think that maybe there could be some change is regulation of tax preparers. There have been bipartisan support for that idea. It's actually got support from the Trump administration, from the IRS, even from industry like H&R Block. So it seems like something that maybe could get across the finish line if it became a priority for the Biden administration or something like that.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think our last question is going to go to Sarah. The Trump administration has suppressed and disregarded data in general. We are seeing real problems with the availability data on the challenges that consumers face during the pandemic, including regarding racial justice concerns. What data do you not have that you think is needed to better size the challenges our nation faces? And what's the best way to have that data collected and reported?
So, first of all, thank you for the Urban Institute always loves questions about data. So thank you. And I think actually now with our focus on racial equity, data is even more important than ever. Let me give one quick example related to the story we heard about the PPP program. The Small Business Administration typically collects data about the racial identity of folks who are applying for their loans. But the Trump administration made a decision not to collect that information in the PPP program, which is just to deny us a source of information. So I do think that the Biden administration is going to have to look across the board and try to make sure that it's not just the traditionally collected categories of Black, Hispanic, sometimes Asian American and other, but we really actually need to better understand how our public programs serve all kinds of communities in society. And we know within Latino, within Asian, there are so many different communities, and we can design better programs. We understand who is and is not being reached. But we also can't trust and can't wait for government to tell us the answers to all these questions. And one of the things we've been doing now, we need information quicker than publicly collected survey information from the public sector, although props to the Census Bureau for its monthly census pulse survey, which has been really important to giving us updated information about the COVID crisis. But we need information quickly, and we need it at a level of disaggregation that we typically don't get. But researchers and my organization and many other places are increasingly trying to put together what we do know about populations and then impute that disaggregation onto data sets that we are getting in real time. So for example, we can look at what we see in the pattern of industrial job loss coming from the UI claims, and then we can look at what we know about geographies where people had those kinds of jobs and start to imagine what neighborhoods are going to see the harm first and target whether it's food assistance, housing assistance, or legal services or other supports to people in those neighborhoods. So I think that we're going to have to start not just waiting for the feds to tell us, but we're going to need this wonderful exploding field of data science and some creative and innovative places with full disclosure and transparency about what's real and what is created. But we use these augmented data science tools to help us predict, you know, who we let into the country, all kinds of safety, and Wall Street is investing billions based on these tools. We can use them to help us understand social problems. And that's going to be a critical part of the next period, both inside government and out.
All right, thank you, Sarah. So before I thank our panelists, I would like to ask the audience to please stay on for literally 2 minutes at the end of this presentation to watch a short video that'll give you a demonstration about how to join face-to-face events like strategy summits and other networking events at this conference. We have some really amazing tools to recreate what the most important part of our conference is, the ability to connect even in a virtual environment. The first strategy summit of our conference is today at 1 o'clock on debt defense. And there'll be many more over the next 2 weeks, as well as just more informal networking opportunities. So as our panelists have made clear, we've got a lot of challenges, but also a lot of opportunities. Lisa pointed out the strong support in the country for many, consumer priorities. In a deeply divided election year, 83% of Nebraska voters voted to cap interest rates at 36%, and Florida voters voted to increase the minimum wage to $15. So we know that the consumer protection agenda is popular across the country, and it's our challenge to bring that perspective to Washington. Now, I can't turn on the microphones for our audience, but I would like to give a resounding virtual round of applause for Paul, Lisa, Gary, Bob, and Sarah. Thank you so much for joining our panel. Thank you for all that you and that your organizations are doing. Thank you to our audience for joining us today and at our conference. And let's all keep fighting together for economic justice.